I want you to think about closing your eyes and trying to tell the difference. Would you be able to, if you close your eyes, would you be able to tell the difference between a 5th grade beginner band and the Dayton Philharmonic Orchestra? Would you know the difference if you just closed your eyes and listened and you're all like, yeah, of course. Maybe some of you have never experienced a 5th grade beginner band. I know that some of you have. We have a couple of times. And when you go to a 5th grade beginner band concert, you don't go expecting to hear good music. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite of that. You expect to not hear good music. And the music, you would define it as awkward, as awful, as maybe honking or screeching. If your kid played a clarinet, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But it's pretty bad. Now, an orchestra is very different than that, right? An orchestra plays beautiful, powerful, uplifting music that just gets you excited. And even if you think you don't like orchestra music, I'm going to tell you that you do. Some of the best movie soundtracks ever made. So I'm thinking like Star Trek. I don't even know what Star Trek's music is like. The theme for Star Wars, right? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. It's an orchestra. And like Lord of the Rings, great soundtrack. I don't know, some of you might remember the movie Last of the Mohicans, one of the best movie soundtracks ever. It's all orchestra. Because the thing about an orchestra is you're pulling together a lot of different people. Oftentimes more than 100. And they're all people who are different. They have different lives. They're from different backgrounds. They have different ideas. They play different instruments, right? You got your woodwinds, you got your brass, you got your strings, you got your percussion. They're all playing different notes at different times, in different ways, at different volumes. And yet when you put it all together, it sounds amazing. Why? Because they're all paying attention to the conductor. You see, the conductor is the one that holds it all together. The conductor understands the music better than anybody else does. All of the musicians, they've got their sheet of music and they're just reading their note, right? They go across the line and they're just playing along, right? Whatever they play, they're just reading their notes. But the conductor has in front of them all of the notes, all of the instruments. So they know exactly how it all fits together. And they know the music better than anybody else does, so they can say to the orchestra, now when we get to this part of the song, I want you to play it this way. And you guys over here, on this part of the song, I want you to play at this volume. And if everybody listens to the conductor and obeys the conductor, the result is beautiful, harmonious music. Now, don't you wish that life could be that way? I mean, you don't have to watch the news for very long, like 30 seconds, to realize we live in a world that does not experience harmony. And it's not because we're all different, right? I mean, we are all different. We all come from different places, different ideas, different backgrounds, but so does an orchestra. And yet we live in a world where there's conflict, where people hate each other, there's violence, there's all kinds of things going on. And I want to suggest that the reason is because we're not listening to the conductor. We're not listening to the one who holds it all together. We're not listening to the one who knows better than we do, who knows more than we do. And when we don't listen to the conductor, our lives feel more like a 5th grade beginner band than a beautiful trained orchestra. So this morning, I want us to listen to the conductor. We're going to look at one verse this morning, and it's one of the most popular verses in the Bible, largely because of its simplicity and its clarity. But it's one of these verses where God just speaks really clearly to us and says, here's what I want you to do, much like a conductor. And I would suggest that if we listen, our lives can radically change. So if you have your Bible, open to Micah 6:8. All right, you can pull it up on your phone or your tablet if you want to do that. We'll put it up on the screen so you can follow along there. This is what it says. It says, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Now, this morning, we're just going to kind of walk through this verse and break it down a little bit. I want you to notice there's 2 parts to it. The first part is like an introduction where it says, he has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? And then the second part of the verse is like the application. There's 3 steps of application. They're really clear. They're really simple: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. But let's start at that first line, right? The first line says, he has told you, O man, what is good. Now, some of your translations might say, he has told you, O mortal. And I actually really like that, because it captures the essence of what Micah is trying to say. The idea here that Micah is projecting to us is that we are very different than God. We are mortal. We are limited. God is immortal. He is unlimited, right? He is eternal. We are temporal. So we're very different than God. And what that means is that God knows better than us. So when God says this is what is good, that's actually what is good. Because God knows more than us. God knows better than us. And because he knows more and better than us, he knows what is good for us. And I would even go so far as to say, if the life you're experiencing right now doesn't feel like the good life, it's probably because either you're not listening to the conductor or you don't really understand what is good. Maybe a way to think about it is cars. Now, you probably have heard me say before, I'm not a car guy, right? You know, there are some people out there, they're car people, and they can smell the exhaust from a car and know immediately what year it is, what make and model it is, what the interior looks like, how many miles it's been driven. They're like, I know all that. That's not me. I know how to drive a car. I know how to stay in the left lane when I'm going fast and in the right lane when I'm going slow. I know how to put gas in it, and beyond that, I don't know much about cars. So imagine I call my mechanic and I say, hey, my car's not running the way I think it should. It's not accelerating really well. It's kind of bumpy. It's making funny noises. Can you take a look at it? And my mechanic says, absolutely, bring it in. So I bring it in. My mechanic looks at it, calls me back and says, I think I figured out the problem. I'm like, great. Tell me what I need to do to make my car good again. And the mechanic says, well, the real issue here is with your thingamabob. Your thingamabob is just not working right. So I think what we need to do is we need to recalibrate the whatchamacallit. And once we recalibrate the whatchamacallit, then we'll just fully replace the doohickey, and then your thingamabob is going to work fine and your car will run good. I say, hey, all right, I get it. I find it, but I want to save a little bit of money. I don't want to, spend more than I have to. And so I say, well, how about this? What if we recalibrate the whatchamacallit, but we just keep the doohickey as it is? He says, no, that's not going to fix your thingamabob. Okay. So what if we do replace the doohickey, but we don't recalibrate the whatchamacallit? Then can I drive it? He's like, well, you can drive it, but it just simply won't be as good because your thingamabob will still not be working. The only way to fix the thingamabob is to recalibrate the whatchamacallit and replace the doohickey. All right, now I have a choice to make, right? I have to choose, am I going to believe my mechanic who knows more about cars, who knows better about cars than I do, or am I going to lean on my own understanding? Because you see, this is what we do with God all the time. God knows better than us. God knows more than us. And even though we know that, we hear what he has to say, and we try to bargain. Well, God, how about if I do this, but not that? Or how about if I fix this part of my life, but I keep this part of my life? When we do that, we're leaning on our own understanding. And I get there are lots of reasons why we do that, right? So, I know that God says I need to live this way, but that's going to be uncomfortable. That's going to require sacrifices. That's going to be terribly unpopular. People might make fun of me. I might lose something. Maybe I'll just, do 70%. When I say to God, I'm going to do 70% of what you say and 30% of what I say, what I'm saying is I know better than you. So Micah 6:8 leads with, he has shown you what is good. Now you have to decide whether or not to believe what God has shown you to be good is actually good, or whether you're going to lean on your own understanding. He then follows that by saying, and what does the Lord require of you? And we could blow past that line if we wanted to get to the application part, but I don't want you to miss the word require, because that's a strong word. It doesn't say, what does the Lord suggest for you? It doesn't say, what does the Lord recommend for you? It doesn't say, what does the Lord encourage you to do? It says, what does God require from you? If we want to understand this word require, one of the ways we can do that is to see where else it appears in the Bible. Like, where else in the Bible does it talk about God actually requiring stuff from us? And if we go all the way back to Genesis, we can see the first time in the Bible where it talks about God requiring something from humanity. It's in Genesis chapter 9. And what's going on in Genesis 9 is that Noah and his family are getting off the ark. So the flood has just happened. Remember, humanity was so awful, so wicked. We were destroying ourselves, killing ourselves off. Left to ourselves, humanity would have destroyed itself. So God intervenes. He sets aside a remnant and he saves them. He wipes the slate clean. And now he's going to rebuild using Noah and his family. And so in Genesis chapter 9, God's talking to them about this rebuild. And he's kind of saying, now, as you guys go forth, you're gonna have babies who have babies who have babies who have babies. You're gonna repopulate the earth. And I want you to do it with my values. So let's talk about my values and how things are going to work. And in the midst of that comes Genesis chapter 9, verse 5. This is what it says. This is God talking to Noah. He says, and for your lifeblood, I will require, there's that word, I will require a reckoning. In other words, Noah, if someone kills you, I will require you people to hold that person accountable. That's what God's saying here. If someone kills another person, I require you to hold that person accountable. He goes on, he says, from every beast, I will require it. Think about what that means. God's actually saying every animal that kills a person will be held accountable by me, by God. God's making a value statement here of how much he values humanity over animals. He's not saying animals are not valuable. I mean, we have dogs. We love dogs. Now, cats are a different story. But we know that God loves dogs. So animals are valuable. But listen, human life is so much more valuable than animal life. He goes on, he says, and from the man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. What God is saying here is I require you to keep each other accountable. And I require you to hold accountable anyone who takes a life. Why? Because God values life. You see, God's values are reflected in what he requires. Why does God value life so much? Well, I mean, we're his creation, but he created us in his image. And so every single life, every single person is created in the image of God, and their life is valuable. And God requires us to not take those lives. Let me just veer off just for a second here, because I think it's practical and timely for me to say this. This is why abortion is an issue for Christians. Okay? Because abortion is not a choice issue, it's a life issue. Now, I get, we all make choices all of the time, right? And we're all responsible for our choices. God says when you make a choice, you're accountable for the choice. Every choice has consequences. I get all of that, right? I can choose to lie. God says, thou shalt not bear false witness. Right? I can choose to steal. God says, thou shalt. You see, just because I can choose something doesn't make it okay. God values life. God values life so much that the first thing he requires of humanity is that we value it also. So if the child in the womb is a life, then that child is created in the image of God, and it is a violation of God's values and a violation of God's requirements if I take that life. Now, I know we could argue till we're blue in the face about where and when life begins and how we know if it's alive and all of that. And y'all know I'm not good at science. So this is just kind of me, just kind of a basic dude saying, here's what I think. It seems to me, if it has a heartbeat, if it has brain activity, if it feels pain, if it's self-aware, then it's alive. Because a rock doesn't do any of that. A clump of cells doesn't do any of that. A tumor doesn't do any of that. If it has brain activity, if it has a heartbeat, if it feels pain, if it's self-aware, then it's alive and it's made in the image of God, and we ought to value it and protect it. okay? Because that's what God values and protects. God loves life. God values the life of the mother. God values the life of the father. And God values the life of the children. And this isn't something that's just in Genesis 9, right? This extends to the whole Bible, God's value on life. And so when we get to Micah 6:8, and we're talking about how much God values life and how much he values human life, we recognize that in his requirements of Micah 6:8, he's telling us this because he values us. The reason he says, what you want to do, what I require of you is to do justice. That's how we relate to each other. We do justice to each other and for each other and with each other because we are all made in the image of God. We love kindness or mercy because we are all made in the image of God. And so Micah 6:8 is a reflection of the heart of God, of the values of God, and his requirements reflect his values. So what is required of you? To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. As I was working on this sermon, one of the things I do when I study the Bible is I just write down observations that I make. So I'm reading a verse, and I'll just have all kinds of observations that I write down. I want to share two of those with you this morning from Micah 6:8. The first is this. These verses are a correction for those who are self-righteous and a prescription for those who want to be righteous. Okay, so let's start with the self-righteous. Sometimes we can get in a place where we think we're doing pretty good. Have you ever been here? Man, I'm really knocking it out of the park right now. God must be so impressed with me. Yeah, I'm reading my Bible every day. I'm praying every day. I've been at church 3 weeks in a row. And one of those weeks, I put something in the offering box. I am really doing well. And to those of us who feel self-righteous, who feel like we're doing well, God would say, you need to check yourself against Micah 6:8, right? Because Micah 6:8 says what really matters is to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. And the other side of that coin is, if I'm thinking to myself, I don't know that I'm doing really well right now. I don't know that I'm living really righteously right now. I want to do better. I want to please God. I want to do what God requires. Well, then here's the prescription. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. Jesus talked about this in Matthew 23. So Matthew 23 is one of those chapters where we see a side of Jesus we don't see very often. All right, we usually think of Jesus as very soft-spoken, kind of meek and mild, loving and kind, and he was all of those things all of the time, but sometimes he didn't really manifest it the way we expect him to, and Matthew 23 is one of those times. He's addressing the Pharisees and the scribes, who are the religious leaders of the day. They're like the pastors, right? They're the ones who have dedicated their lives to learning the Bible. And they know the Bible better than anybody else does. They're trying their very best to live by the Bible and to teach the people how to live by the Bible. And yet Jesus spends all of Matthew 23 telling them they're doing it wrong. He says over and over, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And then he has fun names for them. He calls them blind guides. At one point he calls them snakes and vipers, which remember last week, snakes are our enemy, right? And essentially what Jesus is saying is, you guys are the descendants of the original serpent. Now imagine that. Imagine Jesus coming into our church and confronting me and saying, David, you're a descendant of Satan. That would be pretty shocking. That's what Jesus is doing in Matthew 23. And so he gets to verse 23, and he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. That's one of those insults none of us ever want to hear. Nobody wants to be called a hypocrite. But he says, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin. Picture this, right? These are spices. This is what the Pharisees were doing. They'd go home and they'd get the spice rack out. They'd pull their spices out. And they'd dump them out and measure them on a scale and see how much they had. The reason being, because in the Old Testament, it says you are to tithe 10% of everything you have. And so in their mind, what that meant is, I've got to give 10% of everything I have to God. And so they were actually measuring out their spices to figure out how much was 10% and then bringing 10% of their spices to the temple. Now that's devotion. I don't think anybody this morning opened the cabinet and said, let's give some Lowry's seasoned salt to the church today. Right? How much of this bottle is 10%? Nobody did that today, right? Nobody's that devoted to tithing. And that's okay, you don't have to be. One of the reasons that they did this was because they were so desirous of impressing people. They wanted everybody else to look at them and say, wow, those guys, man, they are so devoted. They're even tithing their spices. That is impressive. But Jesus says to them, you tithe your spices and you've neglected the weightier measures of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. Jesus is actually quoting Micah 6:8 here, because the Pharisees knew Micah 6:8. What Jesus is saying to them is, you guys, you've got your checklist, right? Your righteousness checklist. You're just going down your checklist and checking everything off and think you're doing so amazing. Did you forget what Micah said? Did you forget what God said he requires in Micah? Justice, mercy, faithfulness. You can check off all the boxes, but if you're not doing those things, you're not pleasing God. You're not doing what God requires. And that kind of leads us into the second observation I have from this verse, and it's this, that these verses are not the gospel, but they reveal our need for the gospel. You see, Micah 6:8 cannot save you. You cannot earn God's favor or God's forgiveness by keeping Micah 6:8. And the reason being, because none of us can keep Micah 6:8 perfectly. Okay, there are times in my life when I do justice, right? I treat other people with justice. And there are times when I don't. And there are some times in my life, this is my weak spot. There are some times in my life when I'm a kind person, when I'm a merciful person. But that doesn't come naturally for me. And so there are times in my life when I'm not very merciful at all. And there are times in my life when I do walk humbly in the same direction as God. And there are times in my life when I lean on my own understanding and go my own way. And do you understand, if I'm looking at Micah 6:8, and I'm saying, if I can just do this, then God will like me. If I can just do this, then God will accept me. If I can just do this, then God will forgive me. Then God will never like, accept, or forgive me, because I can't do this. If I'm banking on my own ability to save me, it's a lost cause, because I will mess up. You see, but what this reveals is it reveals my need for the gospel. It reveals my need for someone else to step in and do for me what I can't do for myself. God's requirement is justice, kindness, and walking humbly with him, faithfulness. That's God's requirement. I can't meet God's requirement. I need someone who can, and that's Jesus. Because Jesus came, and for his entire life, he always acted with full justice all the time. He always gave full kindness, full mercy all the time. His life was characterized as one who humbly walked with God. He perfectly met God's requirements. And what he does for me is he takes his perfection and he credits it to my account. So that when God looks at me, he doesn't see someone who misses the requirements, but he sees Jesus hitting the requirements for me, and that's credited to me as righteousness. Now here's the thing. Just because I can't perfectly do something doesn't mean I quit. So I'm not the perfect father. You can ask my kids. They will tell you. Yeah, dad messes up all the time. Not the perfect husband. Marianne will tell you, yes, he's terrible. I mean, she might not say terrible because she's kind and merciful. I was not the perfect student in school, right? I didn't get 100% on every test I take. When I played soccer, I didn't make the perfect pass every time. When I played basketball, I did not make every shot I took. And in none of those did I quit the first time I missed. Because even though I knew I would never be perfect, I kept trying. Because I knew that was what was good for me. That's our approach to Micah 6:8. No, we can't do it perfectly. Jesus did that for us. We're credited with his righteousness. But now, even though we can't do it perfectly, we're still going to do our best to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God, because we know that's what's good for us. So if that's our approach, let's talk about what it looks like. All right? What does it look like to do justice? So let's first talk about what justice is not, okay? Because justice is one of those words that meaning is evolving over time. So justice is not fairness. Sometimes we think justice means everybody gets the same thing. That's not justice. That's not even God. God doesn't give everybody the same thing. In fact, God gives everybody different gifts, different abilities, different circumstances in life. God gives some people more and he gives other people less. Remember Jesus' parable of the talents, where one guy got 5, one guy got 2, and one guy got 1? And we all screamed, that's not fair. That's not the point. It was just. Justice is not fairness. Justice is not stealing from the rich to give to the poor. That sometimes is how we talk about justice these days. That's not justice. And if you're a big Robin Hood fan, I'm sorry I just burst your bubble that Robin Hood was wrong. Right? It's not okay to steal from the rich and give to the poor. That's stealing, and the Ten Commandments clearly prohibit that. Justice is not revenge. Sometimes when somebody does something wrong to me, I may say, I'm going to get justice. I'm going to get justice for myself. No, that's revenge. It's not my job to go out and get revenge on someone else. God has actually set up government in order to do that. In fact, some of the rules and regulations that God put in place with his Israelites were designed specifically so they would learn, I don't seek revenge. I allow the powers that be to pursue justice. I allow God to handle this the way he will, but I don't seek revenge, because all revenge does is escalates the situation. You say something bad about me, I'm going to say 2 things bad about you, right? You slap me, I'm going to slap you twice. That's revenge. That escalates. That's not justice. What justice is justice is me acting righteously in the eyes of God and with my fellow man. That's it. We talk about this all the time, that in God's economy, there's a vertical relationship between me and God. There's a horizontal relationship between me and my brothers and sisters, right? This is what Jesus said. First commandment, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Micah 6:8 follows the same formula, right? Justice is me living righteously in the eyes of God and with my fellow man. So if I want to do justice, that means I have to act in a way that God says is right and that keeps my fellow man in mind. And notice here that what Micah is calling us to is action. He says, do justice. Don't just talk about justice. Don't just think about justice. Do justice. Right? It's an action. If I get on social media and I make a post, I'm like, #be generous. I'm like, yeah, now I'm doing justice. No, you're talking about justice. You're raising awareness for justice, but you're not doing justice. Justice is me saying, what has God given me? How can I use that to bless others? And then actually doing it. Actually giving my stuff away that I don't need, that God has blessed me with for the good of others. That's doing justice. God says, what do I require of you? To do justice, to love kindness. So some of your translations say to love mercy. That's a great translation. The two are very similar, right? They have to do with how I interact with other people, how I view other people. To love kindness or to love mercy means I pay more attention to what others need than to what I need. It means that I think more about others than I think about myself. It means that I seek to understand the needs of others before I tell them about my own. Kindness is given, not earned. Mercy is given, not deserved. In fact, that's the definition of mercy. If they deserve it or if they earn it, it's not mercy, right? It's just a payment. Mercy is what we give specifically to the people who haven't earned it. So if I want to be someone who loves kindness, I can't love myself. I can't be focused on what I deserve, what I'm entitled to, what I have earned. Because if I'm focused there, I'm not focused on others. It would be like if after church today you decide to go to Chili's because they got awesome chips and salsa. And so you go to Chili's and you sit down and your server comes and you're like, yeah, we want the chips and salsa. And you say, but hey, make my salsa like extra, super, extraordinarily spicy hot. I want it to burn my tongue off. And the server's like, great, you got it. So they go and they bring back the chips and salsa, and you reach into the basket and you pick your first chip up, and it's all like flimsy and floppy, and it's dripping with grease, and it probably hasn't even been cooked. And you're like, yeah, that's kind of gross, but you know what? I'll dip it into salsa. That'll make it better. So you dip it into salsa, and you take a bite, and it is so mild you can't even taste it. And you say to yourself, I'm not sure my server even listened to me. And right at that moment, the server shows back up and says, are you ready to order? You're like, I'm ready to order. Let's go. I want a fajita. And the server says, chicken or steak? And you say, steak. I want my red meat. Like, all right. So server comes back later with your meal, and you get your fajita, and you look at it, and you're like, that's chicken. And again, you say to yourself, I'm not sure my server is even paying attention to me. And then as you finish up your meal, the server comes back and says, did you save room for dessert? Part of you says, let's just get out of here. Part of you says, let's give this person one more chance. You know, maybe they're having a bad day. And so you say, yeah, we'll have dessert. And the server says, would you like some of our ice cream? It's really good. You say, no, I can't do ice cream. I'm lactose intolerant. So I'll get really sick if I have ice cream. I'll just take the chocolate cake. So the server says, you got it. Be right back out. Runs back into the kitchen, comes back out carrying a big bowl of ice cream. And at this point, you're thinking to yourself, this server has not listened to a thing I've said. They've gotten it wrong on every occasion. And my natural reaction here is no tip. And I'll even say that out loud. I'm not giving this server a tip. And Mary Ann, because she's kind and gracious, says you need to give a tip. And I said 4%. And she says, no, you need to give more. You see, here's where kindness comes in. Because my natural inclination is to think about what I deserve. To think about what I have earned. Because let's be honest, I'm the one paying here. That server has a job because I'm paying, because I showed up at this restaurant. I've done all the work. Right? I earned that money. And now I'm paying it for stuff I didn't even like. What I really deserve here is an apology and a coupon for a free meal. That's what I deserve. But as long as I'm focused on what I deserve and what I have earned and what I am entitled to, there's no kindness in me. There's no mercy in me. And God says, what I require is mercy. And do you understand this is what Jesus has done for us? I didn't deserve to be saved. I couldn't have earned salvation. I could never do enough good things to earn that from him. And yet God graciously and mercifully saved me from my sins and to eternal life. And every day of my life, every hour of my life, I treat Jesus far worse than he deserves. And he just keeps pouring on the mercy and says to me, I've done this for you. I want you to do this for others. Love kindness, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Walking is directional, right? Whenever the Bible talks about our walk, it's talking about the direction in life that we go. It's the choices we make. It's the steps that we take. And inevitably in life, we all choose the direction we walk. And you can do that. You can choose to walk whatever direction you want. You can choose the path that you want to take. But please understand this. If you don't choose to walk the same direction as God, you're not walking with God. Because he's not changing his direction for you. And if the choices you make in life, if the steps you take in life lead you in a direction that God wouldn't go, then you're walking there alone. And that's why Micah says if you want to walk with God, you need to walk how? Humbly. It means I have to submit my will to him. I have to submit my agenda to him. I have to allow him to direct my paths. I can't lean on my own understanding. I need to follow him. And when I do, that's when I discover the good life. That's why it says, he has shown you what is good. How do you want to find what is good? Well, it's here. It's right here. It's simple and it's clear. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with God. That's how you discover the good life. And of course, this has practical implications in our life, right? So as you think about your life, if you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God at your job, how does that change the way you interact with your coworkers? How does it change the conversations that you're a part of? How does it change the things you say about people? How does it change the things you say to people? How does it change the way you follow those who lead and how you lead those who follow? How does it change your work ethic? How does it change the way you do your time? You see, if I am really committed to doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God, it's going to have implications for me at work. If I do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God in my marriage, how does that change the priorities that we set together? How does that change what I assume about my spouse? How does it change what I'm willing to sacrifice? How does it change how we encourage one another? Because you see, if I choose this path, the path of justice, kindness, faithfulness, there's implications for my family. If I choose to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God in times of crisis and conflict, what will that look like? Maybe it's in conflict with other people. Maybe it's something going on in my life. But will I be a person who only sees the problems and never pursues God's solutions? Will I be a person who pursues peace or who escalates conflict? Will I be a person who only chases after what's good for me, or will I take the mind of Christ and prefer others above myself? And what if I choose to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God in the good times, in times of plenty? You see, if I choose to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God, I cannot be a hoarder. I cannot be someone who's just always trying to get. I can't be someone who's always chasing more, who's always chasing bigger, who's always chasing better. I can't be that person. I can't be a person who's only interested in making myself comfortable and putting myself at ease. If I choose to love mercy, if I choose to do justly, if I choose to walk humbly with God, then in the good times, what I'm saying is, God, you have blessed me so much, how do I pass this blessing on? I'm asking the question, how do I take what God has given to me and pass it on to others? How much can I give away, and where can I give it, and who can I give it to? That's what it means to do justly, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. You see, it does not matter where you are at in life right now. It doesn't matter if you're on the mountaintop or in the valley. It doesn't matter what you have. It doesn't matter what you don't have. God's requirements for you don't change. And they're really clear. And they're really simple. But they're not always easy. So the question for each of us today is, will we choose to simply take the next step? To allow God to point out for us where it is that we can do a better job of doing justice, of loving kindness, and walking humbly with Him. Let's pray.